I remember walking through a crowded electronics market in Beijing back in 2009. A guy I knew, let's call him Lao Wang, had just dropped 5,000 yuan, nearly 2 months' salary for him at the time, on the brand new, officially licensed iPhone 3GS. He was cradling it like a piece of fine jade, his eyes gleaming with the pride of someone who finally owned the ultimate global status symbol. He kept talking about how this miracle device was going to change everything. But then the atmosphere shifted. He wanted to show me how fast the browser was, but as he scrolled through the settings, his thumbs started moving more and more frantically. His face went from a radiant glow to a look of sheer panicked confusion. He looked at me and whispered, "Where's the Wi-Fi?" It wasn't a software bug, and he hadn't bought a lemon. In a move that seems almost hallucinatory by today's standards, the most advanced smartphone in the world had been surgically lobotomized before it was allowed to be sold in China. The Wi-Fi modules were literally soldered off or hardware locked. To the rest of the planet, this phone was the future. To Chinese consumers, the official version was a crippled masterpiece that forced you to burn through expensive 3G data or find a gray market dealer who could hack the chip back to life. That instantaneous realization that you'd paid a premium price for a handicapped piece of tech wasn't just a consumer tragedy. It was the visible scar of a brutal, invisible conflict. Why would a government force the world's biggest tech giant to mutilate its own product? As it turns out, Lao Wang's missing Wi-Fi toggle was the front line of a high-stakes standard war called WAPI. It was a period where national pride, cybersecurity, and billions in patent royalties collided, leaving millions of users stranded in a decade-long Wi-Fi wasteland, where the only way to get the full experience was to become a digital outlaw.
That is such a powerful image. It really is. Standing there, probably in Zhangguankun, with that smell of, I don't know, new plastic and electronics in the air.
Exactly.
And holding this thing that's supposed to be the future, only to find out it's been deliberately broken before you even got it. That missing button, I mean, it's not an exaggeration to say it's one of the most important artifacts for understanding where we are today, geopolitically, I mean.
That feels like a massive claim, though. I mean, we're talking about a missing toggle switch in a settings menu from 15 years ago. How do you draw a straight line from a confused guy in a Beijing market to, the semiconductor sanctions and the 5G battles that are all over the headlines today?
Because that frustration, Lao Wang's frustration, that was the catalyst. You have to understand what that specific phone represented at that specific moment. To him, yes, it was a phone. Yeah. A very expensive phone.
A status symbol.
Absolutely. But to the government planners in Beijing, that phone was a humiliation. It was a physical piece of evidence that they were rule takers, not rule makers. The reason that Wi-Fi button was missing wasn't some technical glitch. It was a geopolitical maneuver that had backfired.
So what was the maneuver?
They tried to force their own domestic Wi-Fi security standard called WAPI on the entire world. And the world, led by the US tech giants, basically said no. So the Chinese consumer, people like Lao Wang, ended up paying the price for that failed power play.
So what we're doing here in this deep dive isn't just looking back at an old piece of tech trivia. We're looking at the origin story of national strategy.
Exactly. We are looking at the boot camp phase. This is where the lessons were learned. If you genuinely want to understand why a company like Huawei is so dominant in 5G, or why there's this almost frantic national push for sovereign silicon and domestic chip manufacturing right now,
you have to go back to this phone.
You have to go back to the wreckage of the WAPI dispute. We're essentially tracing the evolution of a nation's mindset from being a standard taker, which is someone who basically pays rent to use someone else's infrastructure, to becoming a standard maker, the one who owns the building and collects the rent from everyone else.
Okay, let's get into the specifics of that. I want to go back to that moment, 2009, we keep mentioning WAPI. That's W-A-P-I.
REC.
Wireless Authentication and Privacy Infrastructure. I remember at the time, if you were reading the American tech blogs, the Engadgets, the Gizmodos of the world, they treated it like a complete joke. Just another piece of annoying Chinese bureaucracy getting in the way.
They did, and that was a misreading of the situation.
But what was it, technically? Why did they want it so badly?
Well, to be fair to the Chinese engineers who developed it back in the early 2000s, the existing Wi-Fi standard at the time, 802.11, used a security protocol called WEP.
Oh, I remember WEP.
And WEP stood for Wired Equivalent Privacy, which was, let's just say, a very optimistic name. It was garbage, total garbage. You could crack a WEP key in, 5 or 10 minutes with a laptop and a Pringles can for an antenna?
Yeah, people were war driving.
Yeah.
Right. like driving around neighborhoods and just hopping onto people's open network.
Exactly. So the initial argument from Beijing was actually pretty reasonable. They said, look, your global standard is fundamentally insecure. We're a developing country. We're putting a lot of sensitive government and commercial data on these networks. We need something better.
And WAPI was there, something better.
It was their proposed solution. WAPI wasn't just a simple security patch. It was a fundamental change to the architecture of how Wi-Fi worked.
So,
in standard Wi-Fi, the kind we use today, your device, your phone or laptop talks directly to the router. They shake hands, they agree on a password. It's a two-way conversation.
a bilateral agreement.
Right. WAPI introduced a mandatory third party into that conversation, a middleman.
A chaperone.
It required something called an ASU, an authentication service unit. This was a separate, centralized server that had to verify the identity of both the user and the Wi-Fi access point before any data was allowed to flow.
Okay, that sounds incredibly centralized and complicated.
And that's where the real conflict began. The global tech giants, we're talking Intel, Broadcom, Cisco, and by extension the US government, they looked at this ASU requirement and they saw two massive red flags.
What were they?
First, a huge interoperability problem. I mean, a complete nightmare. If you bake this requirement for a centralized server into the hardware itself, then a standard Intel Wi-Fi chip made in a factory in California literally won't work in a coffee shop in Beijing unless you completely redesign the silicon.
It breaks the global standard.
It shatters it. And the second red flag was, well, it was about control. If you are the one who controls that central authentication server, you have a level of oversight, a potential for surveillance that just doesn't exist in the decentralized Western model.
But the real friction, the thing that really caused the breakdown, was commercial, wasn't it? I seem to remember this was all tied up with Intel's Centrino platform.
Absolutely. Intel was the kingmaker in the 2000s. They had that hugely successful Intel Centrino marketing campaign.
The sticker on the laptop.
That little sticker was everything. And for a laptop maker like Dell or HP to get that Centrino sticker, which was the absolute gold standard for consumers, they had to use the Intel CPU, the Intel chipset, and crucially, the Intel Wi-Fi module. It was a bundle.
And Intel said no to WAPI.
Intel drew a line in the sand. They said flat out, we are not redesigning our global chip platform to support a niche Chinese standard. Their position was, we are the global standard. You adapt to us, not the other way around.
And that right there is the standard taker reality. If you don't own the underlying technology, you don't get a vote.
You don't get a vote. And China tried to force the vote anyway. They issued a government mandate. As of June 1st, 2004, all wireless devices sold in China must be WAPI compliant.
A classic top-down move.
And it blew up in their faces. The U.S. government threatened to take them to the World Trade Organization for creating an unfair trade barrier. The entire tech industry basically threatened to boycott the Chinese market. And because it was 2004 and China's leverage wasn't what it is today, they blinked.
They backed down.
They backed down on the mandatory enforcement to avoid a full-blown trade war. But, and this is key, they didn't approve the standard Wi-Fi protocol either. They entered this kind of limbo.
Which leads us to the lobotomy. The policy became, if we can't have our standard, then nobody gets any Wi-Fi at all.
It was a scorched earth retreat, a really self-destructive move in the short term. And this is where we have to talk about the human cost of that geopolitical decision. We mentioned Lao Wang, but let's zoom in on a different persona.
Ken. He's our stand-in for the tech enthusiast of that era.
I was looking through some translated, archived forum posts from back then, places like HippieD and Wayphone, and the overwhelming sentiment was just pure, unadulterated frustration.
Imagine. So, Chen is this guy who has saved up for months to buy the iPhone 3GS. He's read all the reviews. He wants the real deal. So he buys the official China Unicom version because he wants the warranty. He wants to follow the rules.
And he gets punished for being a good citizen.
He gets absolutely crushed for it. He gets home, unboxes this beautiful device, and he's stuck on the 2G network.
Yeah.
We're not even talking 3G speeds. We're talking 80G. Loading a simple web page could take a minute. It was basically unusable.
Meanwhile, his friends
are all at Starbucks, and they're using what they call shruho, which translates to water goods.
The gray market, smuggled phones.
Exactly. Phones smuggled in from Hong Kong or the US that had been jailbroken or had their hardware hacked to bypass all the restrictions. They had fully functional Wi-Fi.
So Chen is sitting there watching his page load pixel by pixel while his friends are streaming videos.
And they're mocking him. I saw the slang they used on the forums. They called the official phone Bone, the castrated version. You paid a premium for the official product, and you're being made fun of for owning a device that was deliberately broken to make some kind of political point you don't even fully understand.
That kind of experience, being made to feel like a second-class citizen in your own country, that leaves a very deep psychological scar, not just on an individual, but on a national level.
This is what you call the WAPI hangover.
But here's the critical pivot in the story. A casual observer might look at Chen's frustration and say, well, the Chinese strategy was a total failure. They alienated their own consumers, they got nothing, and eventually they had to quietly allow Wi-Fi back in. And that's true on a surface level.
Not the whole story.
Not even close. If you look at the long-term strategic trajectory, that failure, that public humiliation, was the single most valuable lesson they could have possibly learned.
What was the lesson then? Don't pick a fight you can't win?
It was more specific than that. The lesson was, you cannot brute force a standard onto the world if you don't have the market and technological leverage. You can't just write a rule on a piece of paper in Beijing and expect Intel and Apple to bow down. It doesn't work. If you want to become a standard maker, you have to play the international game. You have to get inside the organizations that write the rules. You have to beat them at their own game on their own turf.
You're talking about organizations like the 3GPP.
Exactly. The Third Generation Partnership Project. This is the global consortium of telecom companies and engineers that hammered out the standards for 3G, 4G, and now 5G. It's not a government, it's a technical body.
And what did China do?
After the WAPI embarrassment, there was a profound shift in strategy. It went from, let's boycott the Western standard to, let's become the Western standard.
I've seen some of the data on this. Starting around 2015, the number of technical proposals and patent declarations submitted by Chinese companies to the 3GPP just went vertical.
It was a flood, a complete deluge. In the engineering world, some people call it a human wave attack. They mobilized the state-owned enterprises, the private companies like Huawei, the research universities, and they sent thousands of their smartest engineers to every single 3GPP meeting all over the world.
So in these dry technical meetings where they're arguing about channel coding.
Exactly, those meetings. Every time there was a vote on a crucial technical specification like, what's the most efficient way to code the signal for error correction, suddenly, there weren't just proposals from Qualcomm and Ericsson. There were 50 competing proposals from Huawei, ZTE, and the China Academy of Telecommunications Technology.
It's a numbers game. It's about shaping the conversation by sheer volume.
You show up with more people, more research, and more proposals than anyone else, and eventually the standard starts to bend in your direction. And it worked. It absolutely worked.
How can we see that it worked?
Look at the core of 5G technology today. One of the most fundamental components, the coding method used for the control channels, is something called polar codes. Polar codes were developed by a Turkish professor, but they were championed, promoted, and pushed relentlessly through the 3GPP standards process by Huawei. They fought a very bitter, very technical battle against the US-backed LDPC codes, and they won a significant piece of the 5G standard.
So let's bring us all the way back to our guy Chen. If Chen's son goes into a phone store in Shanghai today to buy a new high-end smartphone,
he is not getting a castrated version. He's buying a device where the fundamental language that the phone uses to speak to the cell tower, the very DNA of the 5G signal, is based in part on patents owned by a Chinese company. The deep personal inconvenience that Chen suffered back in 2009 was, from a state perspective, the necessary tuition fee for the technological dominance his son now enjoys in 2025.
That you have to endure the clumsy, painful, inefficient phase to get to the dominant phase. But there's a huge piece missing here, right? You can own the standard on paper. You can have all the patents in the world, but you still need the physical thing. You need the silicon to actually run your standard.
You've hit on the next chapter of the story, the silicon ceiling. This is where the lesson from WAPI evolved, because they learned that even if you write the code, even if you win the standards battle, if a company like Intel or TSMC in Taiwan refuses to manufacture the chip for you, you are still completely dead in the water.
This moves us into the next layer of this strategy. And for this, I want to think about the people who are actually trying to build this stuff back when nobody in the West cared. The researchers in the labs. Let's create another persona, Dr. Lai.
A compositor, a stand-in for the thousands of brilliant engineers and scientists working in state-funded labs in the early 2010s.
Right. So Dr. Li is, let's say, a brilliant cryptographer. She's been working for years on the WAPI protocol, or maybe on China's homegrown 3G standard. She knows the code is elegant. She believes her encryption algorithms are genuinely more secure than what the West is using, but she keeps hitting a wall.
The hardware wall.
She writes her specs, she runs her simulations, and then she goes to the big global semiconductor companies, the Americans, the Europeans, the Taiwanese, and says, I need you to fabricate a chip that natively supports this new Chinese standard.
And what do they tell her?
They essentially laugh her out of the room. They say, the market volume isn't there. We're not going to spend millions retooling our fabrication plant for a niche standard that only your country uses. Here's our standard global chip. Use that or go away.
I read an interview with a researcher from that period who described it perfectly. He said it felt like building a road to nowhere. You are designing this beautiful, multi-lane superhighway of code, but the companies that build the cars are all refusing to drive on it. They're staying on the old, familiar dirt track.
That feeling of utter powerlessness must have been suffocating. You have this moment of realization that your brilliant standard is just a bunch of words in a PDF document if you don't control the physical silicon that brings it to life.
And that realization, experienced by thousands of Dr. Lees across the country, connects directly to the techno-nationalist hypothesis that we see driving Chinese policy today. The leadership in Beijing looked at the plight of these researchers and had an epiphany. Intellectual property isn't just an idea. It has a physical, tangible component. You cannot be a truly sovereign nation in the 21st century if your most critical hardware is designed and manufactured abroad.
Is that the real reason we're seeing this almost obsessive push for semiconductor self-sufficiency right now? I feel like the Western media focuses a lot on the race for the most advanced chips, the 3-nanometer, 5-nanometer stuff for AI that NVIDIA and TSMC are making.
Right, the bleeding edge.
But the data I've seen shows that China is pouring absolutely astronomical sums of money into building foundries for older so-called legacy chips, 28-nanometer, 45-nanometer, even 90-nanometer.
That is the direct, logical response to the trauma of the WAPI and 3G era. Think about what a 28-nanometer chip is. See, it's not going to train the next large language model, but it's the workhorse of the entire global economy.
It's in everything.
It's in your car's braking system, it's in your microwave, it's in the control systems for the power grid, it's in your television, and yes, it's in your missile guidance systems. The lesson from Dr. Lai's era was brutally simple. If we don't own the foundry that makes these boring, essential chips, then a foreign power can turn our country off like a light switch.
So the strategy isn't necessarily to beat TSMC at the 3-nanometer game tomorrow. It's to first build a baseline of self-sufficiency. Ensure that no foreign company can ever lobotomize a Chinese product again by withholding a critical chip.
Exactly. It's about building survival capacity. They're constructing a fortress of older generation silicon. The goal is that if the world cuts them off from all advanced technology tomorrow, the lights stay on, the banks keep running, the cars keep driving, society doesn't collapse. It's the physical infrastructure outcome of a deep-seated psychological insecurity born from that WAPI experience.
It's a never-again mentality. Never again will we be stuck holding a brand new phone with a misty button because some company in California refused to make a chip for us.
And this is a really important point for listeners to understand. This mentality requires massive sacrifices. Specifically, it requires sacrificing short-term market efficiency for the sake of long-term national security. Which brings us to the most difficult and, frankly, the most controversial part of this whole story.
The part where the state forces its own consumers to endure inferior technology for the greater good.
Yes. This is the part of the strategy that really challenges the fundamental Western market-driven mindset. We are raised on the idea that the customer is king. If a product is bad, we don't buy it, and the market, in its infinite wisdom, kills it off.
But in the story we're telling, the bad product is deliberately kept alive on state-funded life support.
Which brings us to our third narrative anchor. Let's talk about the telecom engineer on the ground.
I read a really fascinating retrospective from a senior engineer who worked on the national rollout of TDSCDMA. This was China's homegrown proprietary 3G standard. And let's be blunt about it, by all objective technical measures, it was worse than the global standards, WCDMA and CDMA 2000.
Terrible. I mean, from a user perspective, it was just awful. The signal penetration in buildings was poor, the data rates were slow and unstable, call quality was bad, and because it was a unique standard, the selection of compatible handsets was tiny and expensive.
This engineer described his daily life in the mid-2000s as a constant, soul-crushing battle against reality. He's out in these rural provinces trying to install and calibrate these TDSCDMA towers, and the local villagers are screaming at him because their calls keep dropping. The The marketing department back in Beijing is running these big patriotic campaigns about using our national pride 3G service, but everyone with any choice was trying to get on the other more reliable networks.
He felt like he was fighting against market logic. And in a truly free market, he would have lost. TDSCDMA would have gone bankrupt within a year.
But the state didn't let it die. China Mobile, the biggest carrier in the world, was ordered to adopt it.
Exactly. And this is the perfect illustration of the macro over micro philosophy. The state planners looked at the entire situation and made a cold calculation. They said, yes, we know this standard is technically inferior. We know our consumers are unhappy. But if we just give up and adopt the mature Western standard, we will learn nothing. We will forever be paying royalties to Qualcomm and Ericsson. We will never learn how to build and operate a national mobile network ourselves.
So the dropped calls, the slow data, the customer complaints, that was a feature, not a bug.
It was the learning fee. The billions of yuan in wasted investment, the millions of hours of consumer frustration, that was the tuition the nation had to pay to enter the school of telecommunications. By forcing the domestic operators to deploy this clumsy, inefficient, homegrown standard, they forced an entire domestic ecosystem to be born.
Right. Suddenly you couldn't just buy off-the-shelf antennas from a Swedish company. You needed Chinese companies to learn how to design and build TDSCDMA antennas.
You needed Chinese software companies to write the network switching software. You needed Chinese firms to make the specialized test and measurement equipment. You were building the muscle memory of an entire industry.
And the payoff came later.
The payoff came with 4G and especially 5G. Those same companies who had cut their teeth and made all their mistakes on the terrible 3G network were now seasoned veterans. They had this incredible institutional capacity. They could roll out a world-class 5G network faster, cheaper, and at a greater scale than any of their foreign competitors because they had been through the brutal boot camp of TDSCDMA.
It's what you call the collective survival ethos. The core idea is that the individual's convenience, Lao Wang's missing Wi-Fi, Chen's slow downloads, the engineer's dropped calls, all of that is secondary to the nation's long-term goal of technological independence.
It's a harsh calculus, a very utilitarian one. But if you look at the 5G network map of China today, which is by far the largest and arguably most advanced in the world, you have to admit that from their perspective, the calculus worked. They endured the worst technology for a decade in order to eventually own the best technology.
This philosophy, this way of thinking, it doesn't just apply to building phone networks, though. It seems to be a fundamental worldview that organizes the entire corporate and technological world into a clear hierarchy.
There's a mantra that you see over and over again in Chinese industrial policy documents from the last 2 decades. It's a very simple and very ruthless breakdown of the world. It goes, third-tier companies make products. Second-tier companies make technology. First-tier companies make standards.
That is such a stark way of putting it.
But it's brutally accurate, isn't it? Think about the third tier. If you're a company like Foxconn, you make products. You are an assembler. You perform the hard physical labor of putting the iPhone together. Your profit margins are razor thin.
Okay, then second tier making technology. What does that mean? Making a component like the screen or the battery.
Exactly. You own some intellectual property. You have some specialized skill. Maybe you make the best OLED screens or the most efficient camera sensor. You're more valuable than the assembler, but you are still fundamentally a supplier. You are still waiting for a first-tier company to place an order.
But the first tier, making the standards.
That is the top of the food chain. That is the throne. If you are a company like Qualcomm and you own a portfolio of essential patents for the CDMA or 5G standard, you don't have to build a single factory. You don't have to get your hands dirty.
You just collect checks.
You just sit back and collect a royalty check every single time a smartphone is sold anywhere in the world by anyone. You are effectively taxing the entire global industry for the privilege of existing.
And the ultimate goal of Chinese industrial policy for the last 20 years has been to stop paying the tax and become the tax collector.
That is the single most important driving force behind everything we're discussing. It's the motivation behind a national strategy document called China Standards 2035. This is the official blueprint for the next decade. And they're not just looking at telecom anymore. Everything. Artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, smart cities, autonomous vehicles, green energy, ultra-high voltage power transmission. In every single one of these emerging fields, the goal is to define the foundational standards, to set the rules for how these technologies will work on a global scale.
And they're not just trying to set the standards within China, they're trying to export them.
Exactly. Take the Digital Silk Road, which is the tech component of the Belt and Road Initiative. If a Chinese company goes and builds a new smart city for the government of Kenya or Indonesia, they aren't just pouring concrete and installing fiber optic cables, they're installing their own technical standards. They're setting up the data protocols, the network architecture, the IoT communication standards.
And once you install your standard in a country's core infrastructure, you create a powerful lock-in effect.
It's the ultimate lock-in. If your city's traffic light system is built from the ground up on a Chinese IoT protocol, who are you going to buy your replacement sensors from in 10 years?
A Chinese company.
Who are you going to hire to do the software upgrades and the security patches? You're locked into their technological ecosystem for the next 30 or 40 years.
So it's not just about selling products made in China. It's about embedding the rules by China into the infrastructure of other countries.
And this creates a fundamental philosophical clash with the West. The traditional US and European model for setting standards has been, for the most part, bottom-up. It's industry-led.
Engineers from competing companies get in a room and argue.
Right. Engineers from Apple and Google and Samsung and Ericsson get together in a standards body and they argue and collaborate until they agree on the best technical solution. It's slow and it's largely voluntary.
Whereas the Chinese model we've been describing, from WAPI to TDSCDMA to 5G, is aggressively top-down. It's state-led and strategic.
It is deeply strategic. The sources we looked at talk a lot about civil-military fusion. In this worldview, a technical standard for something like IoT isn't just about commercial efficiency so your smart toaster can talk to your fridge. It's also about national security. The line between a civilian communication protocol and a military one becomes extremely blurry.
But you can't argue with the results. If you can align your entire industrial base, your universities, and your government behind a single strategic goal, you can move incredibly fast.
It is incredibly effective at mobilizing resources and achieving scale, but it carries an enormous risk. The risk is isolation. If you push too hard for a standard that nobody else in the world wants, like they did with WAP, you end up cutting yourself off. You create a technological island, a Galapagos effect, where your technology evolves in a weird, incompatible way.
But the big difference now, compared to 2009, is the sheer gravity of the Chinese market. Back then, foreign companies like Intel felt they could afford to bully China. They could just say, no, we're not supporting WAPI, and get away with it.
That leverage has almost completely flipped. This is what we can call the foreign company dilemma today. Look at the major international companies operating in China now. Tesla, Apple, Volkswagen. They are not just selling products there, they are deeply, deeply embedded in the ecosystem.
We used to hear a lot about forced technology transfer, the idea that to get into the Chinese market, you had to hand over your intellectual property. The price of admission?
It was essentially a forced marriage. The deal was, you want access to our billion consumers. Fine, but you have to set up a joint venture with a domestic Chinese firm, and you have to share your technology with them. In the early days, you saw a lot of protests. Foreign companies complained, ambassadors wrote letters, there were lawsuits.
Well, now they just seem to comply.
They comply because they've walked into what some analysts call the technology trap. They became so dependent on China for its manufacturing efficiency on the one hand and its enormous market size on the other that they lost their leverage to say no. So now you see these huge multinational corporations forming JVs and aligning with Chinese standards, not just because the law says they have to, but because they realize they need to be embedded in that ecosystem to survive globally.
It's a complete 180-degree turn. In 2009, China was the digital outlaw, the one breaking the global rules by soldering Wi-Fi chips off motherboards. Now, they are increasingly the ones writing the rules for new technologies, and it's the foreign companies who are scrambling to adapt to them.
That crippled iPhone without Wi-Fi wasn't a mistake. It was a prototype, a clumsy, painful first draft of a long-term strategy that has now reached the state of maturity.
That Lao Wang in that crowded electronics market, staring at his brand new broken phone.
Lao Wang was a casualty of that war. He was the collateral damage. He and millions of others like him were the ones who paid that learning fee we talked about. They paid with their money and with their frustration.
And if that same Lao Wang were to go back to that same market today, maybe he's buying a new 5G phone for his grandson, what does he see?
He sees a device that is, in many ways, the result of that war being won. He sees a state-of-the-art 5G phone that runs on a network built entirely by Chinese companies, using communication standards that were co-invented and patented by Chinese researchers, powered increasingly by advanced semiconductor chips that are fabricated in Chinese foundries.
The inconvenience he suffered was weaponized into independence for the next generation.
That is the perfect way to summarize the entire journey. We in the West tend to think of efficiency as the ultimate good, the fastest, the cheapest, the easiest for the consumer. But this whole story is a powerful lesson that sometimes nations will deliberately choose inefficiency. They will choose the harder path, the slower path, the more expensive path, because they believe that at the end of that road, they will own the road itself.
Control is the prize, and it seems they were willing to pay a very, very high price in consumer pain and wasted capital to achieve it.
And they are still paying it. This is not over. The semiconductor war is escalating. The global battle for who will write the standards for artificial intelligence is just beginning. The playbook that we saw them develop with WAPI is being run again, right now, in real time, in these new domains.
It really makes you wonder what we're overlooking today, doesn't it? When we look at the news and we see some clumsy, heavy-handed new regulation coming out of China, maybe it's about generative AI or data security or green energy storage, and our first instinct is to laugh at it. They're stifling innovation again. They're making it harder for their own users.
We should be very, very careful about laughing.
Right, because if this history is any guide, that clumsiness might just be the sound of the foundation being poured. The awkward, frustrating, crippled product of today could be laying the groundwork for the unassailable global standard of tomorrow.
That is exactly the reality we need to be prepared for.
We've gone from a single missing toggle switch on a phone to a complete global power shift. Thanks for walking us through that. Fascinating.
Pleasure. It's a vital story to understand.